Marcus Chen was loading groceries into his truck when he saw her, a woman in military fatigues standing helplessly beside a broken-down sedan with 4 children huddled around her. Rain poured down relentlessly, soaking them all to the bone. He didn't hesitate to help, but when her youngest son looked up at him with knowing eyes and whispered, "You knew my daddy, didn't you?" Marcus felt his world tilt. The boy had recognized something. A tattoo, a memory, a connection that would unravel secrets Marcus had carried for years. What this soldier mom didn't know was that her husband's death had haunted Marcus every single day since Afghanistan, and what Marcus didn't know was that this chance encounter would finally give him the redemption he'd been searching for. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button for more real, emotional, life-changing stories like this, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The rain hammered against the grocery store parking lot with a vengeance that Friday evening, turning the asphalt into rivers of runoff that swirled around the wheels of abandoned shopping carts. Marcus Chen pulled his baseball cap lower over his eyes as he loaded the last bag of groceries into the bed of his pickup truck, the paper sack already beginning to soften under the assault of moisture. His 10-year-old daughter Lily waited in the passenger seat, her face pressed against the foggy window as she watched the storm with the fascination that only children possess for nature's dramatic displays. "Dad, hurry up!" she called through the slightly cracked window, her voice barely audible over the drumming of rain on metal. "I'm getting hungry, and you promised we'd make spaghetti tonight." Marcus smiled despite the water dripping from the brim of his cap. Louie had been looking forward to their Friday night cooking tradition all week, ever since her mother had moved across the country for a new job 6 months ago. These small rituals had become their anchor, the thing that kept their little family of 2 steady when everything else seemed to be shifting beneath their feet. He slammed the tailgate shut and was about to climb into the driver's seat when movement caught his eye across the parking lot. A woman stood beside a white sedan, its hood raised like a surrendering flag in the downpour. She wore military fatigues that were now plastered to her frame, and her short auburn hair was slicked back from her face. But it wasn't the woman herself that made Marcus pause. It was the 4 children clustered around her, ranging from what looked like a teenager down to a boy who couldn't have been more than 6 years old. The youngest was crying, his small shoulders shaking with more than just cold, while the woman knelt beside him trying to offer comfort she clearly didn't feel herself. Marcus had seen that look before, in mirrors and in the faces of other veterans who carried invisible wounds. It was the expression of someone trying to hold everything together when the world seemed determined to fall apart. His hand was already on the door handle of his truck when he noticed the woman pulling out a cell phone, holding it up in various directions as if searching for a signal that wasn't there. The futility of her gesture in the middle of the storm was evident even from a distance. "Dad?" Lily's voice came through the window again, this time with a note of concern rather than impatience. She had followed his gaze and spotted the family by the broken-down car. "Are they okay?" The question hung in the air for a moment as Marcus weighed his options. He could mind his own business, drive home to their warm apartment and their promised spaghetti dinner. He could tell himself that someone else would help, that it wasn't his responsibility to rescue strangers in parking lots. But as he watched the woman wrap her arms around her youngest child while the other 3 pressed closer to her for warmth, he knew there was really no choice at all. "Stay here for a minute, sweetheart," he told Lily, pulling his hood up over his cap. "I'm going to see if they need help." The distance between his truck and the stranded family felt longer than it should have as Marcus jogged through the rain, dodging puddles and abandoned shopping carts. Up close, he could see that the woman's military uniform bore the name Roberto Rodriguez and the rank insignia of a staff sergeant. Her children had the hollow-eyed look of kids who had been moving around too much, their clothes a mismatched collection of handmade downs and thrift store finds that spoke of a family stretching every dollar. "Excuse me," Marcus called out as he approached, raising his voice to be heard over the storm. "Car trouble?" Staff Sergeant Rodriguez looked up sharply, her hand instinctively moving to her hip where a weapon would have been in a combat zone. The gesture was so automatic that Marcus knew she was recently returned from deployment, still carrying the hypervigilance that kept soldiers alive in dangerous places. Her dark eyes assessed him quickly, cataloging threat levels and escape routes in the space of a heartbeat, before she seemed to remember she was in a grocery store parking lot in suburban Denver, not a forward, quote, operating base in some distant country. Engine died, she said simply, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone accustomed to giving orders and having them followed. AAA says it'll be at least 2 hours before they can get a truck out here. Marcus glanced at the children, noting how they huddled together with the practiced efficiency of kids who had learned to weather storms both literal and metaphorical. The oldest was a girl who looked to be about 14, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail that was already coming loose in the wind. Next to her stood twin boys who appeared to be around 12, their faces identical masks of stoic acceptance. The youngest, the one who had been crying, had stopped now, but was still pressed against his mother's side with the desperate grip of a child who had learned that people could disappear without warning. 2 hours in this weather with 4 kids, Marcus said, shaking his head. That's not going to work. He gestured toward his pickup truck, where Lily's face was still visible through the rain-streaked window. I've got room in my truck. I can give you all a ride somewhere warm, maybe to a hotel or wherever you're staying. The offer seemed to catch Rodriguez off guard, as if kindness from strangers was so foreign a concept that she needed a moment to process it. Her eyes flicked between Marcus and his truck, then back to her children who were all watching the exchange with the intense focus of kids who knew their immediate future depended on adult decisions they had no control over. I appreciate the offer, but we don't really have anywhere to go, she admitted after a moment, her military bearing wavering slightly. We just got back from Fort Carson today. I'm getting out of the service and we're supposed to drive to Phoenix tomorrow to stay with my sister while I look for work, but... She gestured helplessly at the dead car. Not exactly going according to plan. Marcus felt something twist in his chest at the admission. He knew the statistics, had read the reports about veterans struggling with the transition to civilian life, families displaced by military downsizing and deployments that stretched longer than originally planned. But knowing the numbers was different from seeing it played out in the rain-soaked parking lot, watching a soldier who had served her country trying to figure out how to keep her children warm and dry. Look, I know this might sound crazy, but I live about 10 minutes from here, he heard himself saying, the words coming out before his rational mind could intervene. It's just me and my daughter, and we've got a couch that folds out, hot food, and a roof that doesn't leak. You could crash there tonight. Figure out your next move when the weather clears. The silence that followed was filled only by the drumming of rain and the distant rumble of thunder. Rodriguez stared at him with an expression that cycled through suspicion, hope, and something that might have been desperation before settling on a wary kind of gratitude. Why would you do that? She asked finally. You don't even know us. It was a fair question, one that Marcus wasn't entirely sure he could answer himself. Part of it was simple human decency, the kind of help he hoped someone would offer his own daughter if she were ever stranded and scared. But there was something else. Something in the way Rodriguez held herself with military precision, even while everything around her was falling apart. Something in the patient way her children waited for her decisions that reminded him of other soldiers, other families, other times when the difference between helping and walking away had been measured in lives rather than just convenience. Maybe because someone should, he said simply. The youngest boy, who had been silent through the entire exchange, suddenly stepped forward and looked up at Marcus with eyes that seemed far too old for his small face. There was something in his gaze, a searching quality that made Marcus uncomfortable, as if the child was looking for something specific and might actually find it. What's your name? The boy asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Marcus, he replied, crouching down to bring himself closer to the child's eye level. What's yours? Diego, the boy said, and then, with the kind of blunt honesty that only children possess, you look sad, like my mama when she thinks about my daddy. The observation hit Marcus like a physical blow, knocking the breath from his lungs in a way that had nothing to do with the cold rain soaking through his jacket. There was something in Diego's voice, in the way he said, Daddy, with the past tense resignation of a child who had learned too young that some people don't come home, that made Marcus's hands shake as he stood back up. Rodriguez's expression had shifted too, from wary gratitude to sharp-eyed assessment. "Diego, honey, get back over here," she said, but her voice was gentler now, as if her son's words had revealed something she hadn't expected to see. "It's okay," Marcus managed, though his voice sounded strange even to his own ears. Kids have a way of seeing things adults miss. But Diego wasn't finished. He stepped closer to Marcus, close enough that the rain dripping from the man's jacket splashed onto his sneakers, and said with the kind of certainty that children sometimes possess about things they couldn't possibly know, "You were Soldier 2." It wasn't a question, and the flat certainty in the boy's voice made Marcus's chest tighten. He glanced up at Rodriguez, who was watching the exchange with an expression that had gone from curious to something approaching recognition, as if pieces of a puzzle she hadn't known she was solving were suddenly clicking into place. "How did you know that?" Marcus asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. Diego's response was to point at Marcus's left forearm, where the edge of a tattoo was visible below the cuff of his jacket sleeve. "My daddy had one just like that. Mama showed me pictures." The world seemed to tilt sideways as Marcus followed the boy's gaze to his own arm, to the black ink barely visible beneath wet fabric. It was a simple design, nothing elaborate or unique, just a series of numbers and letters that marked a specific unit, a specific deployment, a specific group of soldiers who had served together in a specific place at Adriano. A specific time. The kind of tattoo that thousands of veterans carried, but Diego's words suggested this particular combination of numbers and letters meant something more than just military service. Rodriguez was staring now too, and Marcus could see the exact moment when recognition dawned in her eyes. Her face went pale beneath the rain-soaked exhaustion, and her hand moved to cover her mouth, as if she could hold back words that were already forming. "2nd Battalion, 87th Infantry Regiment," she whispered, and it wasn't a question either. Marcus felt the blood drain from his face as he nodded slowly. The numbers and letters that Diego had recognized were indeed unit designations, but they were more than that. They were a memorial, a way of carrying the names and memories of brothers who hadn't made it home, inked into skin so they would never be forgotten. And if Diego's father had carried the same markings, if Rodriguez knew what they meant, then this chance encounter in a rainy parking lot was no coincidence at all. "What was your husband's name?" Marcus asked, though he was already starting to suspect he knew the answer. "Staff Sergeant Roberto Rodriguez," she said, her voice barely audible over the rain. "Kia, March 15th, 2018, Kandahar Province." The date hit Marcus like a sledgehammer to the chest, driving him back a step as 7 years of carefully buried memories came rushing to the surface. March 15, 2018. The day the convoy had hit the IED. The day everything went wrong. The day Roberto Rodriguez died in Marcus's arms, while Marcus screamed for a medic who was already dead. While the desert sun beat down on sand that was turning red with blood, while the sound of automatic weapons fire echoed off the mountains in the distance. "Oh, God," Marcus breathed, and his legs suddenly felt like they might not hold him up. "You're Roberto's family." Rodriguez, whose first name Marcus had never learned despite having served alongside her husband for 8 months, nodded slowly. Her children were watching the exchange with wide eyes, sensing the importance of something they couldn't fully understand. Even Lily had gotten out of the truck and was approaching through the rain, drawn by the obvious emotional weight of whatever was happening between the adults. "He talked about you," Rodriguez said quietly. In his letters, in his emails, Marcus Chen, the staff sergeant who kept everyone's spirits up, who could fix anything that broke, who looked out for the younger soldiers like they were his own brothers. Marcus closed his eyes as the words washed over him, each one carrying the weight of memories he had spent years trying to forget. Roberto Rodriguez had been 26 years old, just a year younger than Marcus, with a wife and 4 children back home, and a laugh that could brighten even the worst days in that God-forsaken desert. He had been the kind of soldier who always volunteered for the dangerous missions, who shared his care packages from home with anyone who needed them, who carried pictures of his family everywhere and talked about his plans for when he got back to the States. "I should have saved him," Marcus said, the words coming out before he could stop them. "I tried, but I couldn't. I wasn't fast enough. I wasn't good enough. I should have. Stop. Rodriguez's voice cut through his spiral of self-recrimination like a blade. Just stop. She stepped closer, close enough that he could see the tears mixing with rainwater on her face. Roberto wrote about that day, about how you pulled him out of the burning vehicle, how you stayed with him, how you held his hand while he died. He wasn't conscious for most of it, but he was awake long enough to ask you to tell me and the kids that he loved us. The memory hit Marcus with crystalline clarity, as fresh and painful as if it had happened yesterday instead of 7 years ago. Roberto's blood on his hands, Roberto's final words whispered through broken ribs and punctured lungs, Roberto's eyes going still while the sound of helicopters grew louder in the distance. And yes, the message Marcus had promised to deliver, but never had, because how do you call a stranger and tell them their husband's last thoughts were of them? How do you put that kind of pain into words that make sense over code? A telephone line. I never called, Marcus admitted, his voice breaking. I meant to, I wanted to, but I didn't know what to say. How do you tell someone that? How do you make it mean something when it feels like nothing you say could possibly be enough? Rodriguez was crying openly now, tears streaming down her face as she reached out and grabbed Marcus's hands with both of hers. Her grip was strong, the hands of someone who had learned to hold on to what mattered, and her eyes were fierce with an emotion Marcus couldn't quite name. You just did, she said simply. You just told me. Around them, the storm continued to rage, but something had shifted in the space between the two families. Diego stepped forward again, his small hand reaching out to touch the tattoo on Marcus's arm, with the reverence of a child touching something sacred. He carries my daddy with him, Diego said to his mother, his voice filled with the kind of wonder that only children can muster in the face of mystery. That's why he looks sad. He's been carrying daddy all this time. The simplicity of the observation, the way Diego had distilled years of guilt and grief and survivor's remorse into something so pure and uncomplicated, broke something open in Marcus's chest. He dropped to his knees in the rain, not caring about the water soaking through his jeans, and looked into Diego's eyes. Your daddy was a good man, he said, his voice thick with emotion. He was brave and funny and kind, and he loved you and your mama and your brothers and sister more than anything in the world. Every day, right up until the end, he talked about coming home to you. Diego nodded solemnly, as if this confirmation of his father's love was something he had needed to hear but hadn't known how to ask for. Will you tell me about him sometime? About what he was like when he was being a soldier? I'd like that, Marcus said, meaning it more than he had meant anything in years. Lily had finally reached them, her sneakers splashing through puddles as she took in the scene with the kind of emotional intelligence that had helped her navigate her parents' divorce with more grace than many adults could muster. She looked between Marcus and Rodriguez, between Diego and the other children, and seemed to understand instinctively that something important was happening. Dad, she said quietly. Are you okay? Marcus stood up, his knees protesting after kneeling on wet asphalt, and put his arm around his daughter's shoulders. Yeah, kiddo, I think maybe I'm going to be. He looked at Rodriguez, who was wiping her eyes with the back of her hand while her children pressed closer to her. But right now, we all need to get out of this rain before we catch pneumonia. The logistics of fitting 6 people into a pickup truck designed for 5 were complicated, but they managed it with the kind of creative problem-solving that military families excel at. The twin boys, whose names turned out to be Carlos and Miguel, squeezed into the back seat with Lily and Diego, while the oldest girl, Isabella, rode in the front between Marcus and her mother. It was cramped and awkward, with elbows bumping and knees knocking, but there was something comforting about the closeness, the way they all fit together like pieces of a puzzle that had finally found their proper places. Marcus's apartment was nothing fancy, just a 2-bedroom unit in a complex that had seen better days. But it was warm and dry and filled with the kind of comfortable clutter that accumulates when 2 people are trying to build a life together from scratch. Lily immediately took charge of showing the Rodriguez children around, her natural hostess instincts kicking in as she pointed out the bathroom, the kitchen, the couch that folded out into a bed just like her father had promised. Are you hungry? she asked the group, already moving toward the refrigerator with the confidence of someone who knew where everything was kept. Dad was going to make spaghetti, but we've got enough for everyone if you want some. The offer of food seemed to break through whatever remaining walls the Rodriguez family had been keeping up, and suddenly Marcus's quiet apartment was filled with the kind of controlled chaos that only comes with multiple children in a small space. Isabella helped Lily gather ingredients while the twins explored the living room with the careful curiosity of kids who had learned not to touch things that didn't belong to them. Diego attached himself to Marcus's side like a small shadow, watching everything the man did with the intense focus of someone memorizing important details. Rodriguez herself seemed to be struggling with the adjustment from crisis mode to acceptance of help, her military training warring with the exhaustion that came from months of trying to hold everything together alone. She sat at Marcus's small kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone cold while she watched her children begin to relax for the first time in what looked like weeks. "I keep waiting for the catch," she admitted quietly when Marcus sat down across from her. "For you to tell me what you want in return, or what the strings are, or when we need to leave. Nobody does this, helps complete strangers like this." Marcus took a sip of his own coffee, considering her words. "Maybe that's the problem," he said finally. "Maybe not enough people do this, help strangers. Maybe that's why so many of us end up carrying things we weren't meant to carry alone." In the living room, Lily was explaining the rules of some complicated board game to the Rodriguez children, her voice animated and patient as she walked them through strategy and objectives. Diego had wandered back over to where the adults were sitting, drawn by some invisible thread that seemed to connect him to Marcus in ways that defied easy explanation. "What happened to your arm?" Diego asked suddenly, pointing at a scar that ran from Marcus's wrist halfway to his elbow, a jagged line of white tissue that looked like it had been caused by something sharp and unforgiving. "Diego," Rodriguez said sharply, "that's not polite to ask." But Marcus shook his head, rolling up his sleeve to show the full extent of the scarring. "It's okay. It's from the same day your daddy died, shrapnel from the explosion." He traced the line with one finger, remembering the way the metal had torn through his flesh, the way the pain had seemed insignificant compared to watching Roberto bleed out in the sand. "The doctors said I was lucky it didn't hit anything important." Diego reached out and touched the scar with one small finger, his face serious. "Does it hurt?" "Sometimes," Marcus admitted. "But not as much as other things." The boy nodded, as if this made perfect sense to him, as if he understood intuitively that some wounds were visible and some weren't, but they all left marks that lasted longer than anyone expected. He climbed up onto Marcus's lap with the unself-conscious ease of a child who had decided to trust someone, and settled there like he belonged. "Tell me about my daddy," Diego said quietly. "Tell me about when he was a soldier." So Marcus did. He told Diego about Roberto's terrible jokes and his amazing ability to find the best hiding spots during sandstorms. He told him about the way Roberto would sing Spanish lullabies while he cleaned his rifle, and how he had taught half the unit to make his grandmother's recipe for rice and beans using only military rations and creativity. He told him about Roberto's pride in his children, how he carried their pictures in his helmet and their letters in his breast pocket, how he would read parts of their letters aloud to anyone who would listen because he couldn't contain his joy at being their father. As he talked, Marcus became aware that the entire apartment had gone quiet, that everyone was listening to these stories about a man who had been lost but not forgotten, whose memory lived on in the ink on Marcus's skin and the love in his family's hearts. Rodriguez was crying again, but these were different tears, the kind that came from hearing about her husband through the eyes of someone who had known him as more than just a name on a casualty report. "He sounds wonderful," Isabella said softly when Marcus finished his latest story. "I wish I remembered him better. I was only 7 when he died." "You remember the important parts," Marcus told her. "You remember that he loved you, that he was proud of you, that he would have given anything to see you grow up into the amazing person you're becoming." The conversation continued long into the evening, stories flowing back and forth like water finding its own level. Rodriguez shared memories of Roberto as a husband and father, the man who built blanket forts and taught his children to dance and never missed a bedtime story even when he was exhausted from training. The children added their own fragments of memory, small moments that had taken on greater significance in the years since their father's death. When it came time for sleeping arrangements, they discovered that the fold-out couch was more comfortable than it looked, and that 5 people can actually fit on it if they didn't mind being close together. Marcus offered to take the floor, but Rodriguez wouldn't hear of it, insisting that he had already done more than enough by opening his home to them. "Besides," she said with a tired smile, "we're used to making do with less space than this. Military housing teaches you to be creative with sleeping arrangements." Marcus retreated to his own room, but sleep proved elusive. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Roberto's face, heard Roberto's voice, felt the weight of promises made and unmade in the space between heartbeats. But for the first time in 7 years, the memories weren't entirely painful. They were still difficult, still tinged with loss and regret, but they were also filled with something else now, something that felt almost like peace. In the morning, Marcus woke to the sound of voices in the kitchen and the smell of coffee brewing. He found Rodriguez up early, her military habits apparently unaffected by civilian life, sitting at his table with her phone and a notebook spread out in front of her. She had changed out of her uniform into civilian clothes that looked like they had been packed hastily, and her hair was pulled back in a ponytail that was somehow both practical and feminine. "Morning," she said quietly, looking up from her phone. "I hope you don't mind. I used your Wi-Fi to check my email and make some calls about the car." "Of course not," Marcus said, moving toward the coffee maker with the automatic movements of someone whose brain didn't fully function before caffeine. "Any good news?" Rodriguez's expression was complicated, a mixture of relief and concern that suggested the news was both good and bad. "The car is totaled, apparently. Something about the engine block cracking when it overheated. Insurance will cover most of it, but not enough to buy something reliable enough to drive to Phoenix." Marcus poured himself a cup of coffee and sat down across from her, noting the way her hands were twisted together on the table, the tension in her shoulders that spoke of someone trying to solve an impossible problem. "What are your options?" "Well, I could rent a car, but that's expensive, and they want a deposit I don't have right now. I could try to buy something cheap here in Denver, but cheap cars don't make good road trip vehicles, and I can't afford to get stranded again." She gestured helplessly at her notebook, which was covered with numbers and calculations that apparently didn't add up to a solution. "Or I could ask my sister to wire me money, but she's already doing so much by letting us stay with her while I get back on my feet." Marcus sipped his coffee, thinking about the problem from multiple angles. He had spent enough years in the military to understand the complicated pride that made asking for help feel like failure. The way accepting charity could feel like admitting defeat, even when logic dictated otherwise. But he had also learned, through hard experience and painful losses, that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was let someone else carry part of the weight. "What if I drove you?" he heard himself saying, the words coming out before he had fully processed the implications. "To Phoenix, I mean. I've got vacation time saved up, and Lily's been wanting to see the Grand Canyon. We could make it a road trip, get you and the kids where you need to go, and make an adventure out of it." Rodriguez stared at him like he had just suggested flying to the moon. "Marcus, that's insane. You barely know us, and it's a 12-hour drive, and you'd have to drive back alone, and Roberto would have done the same thing for me," Marcus said quietly, cutting through her protests with the simple truth that had been driving his decisions since the moment he had seen her stranded in the parking lot. "If our positions were reversed, if it was me and Lily stuck in a strange city with no way to get home, Roberto would have moved heaven and earth to help us. The least I can do is drive his family to Phoenix." The silence that followed was filled with the sound of children beginning to stir in the living room. Voices raised in the kind of good-natured arguing that suggested siblings who were comfortable enough to be themselves around each other. Rodriguez was staring down at her notebook, but Marcus could see the tears gathering in her eyes again. "Why are you being so kind to us?" she asked finally. "I know you said Roberto would have done the same thing, but that doesn't explain why you're willing to turn your life upside down for people you met 12 hours ago." Marcus considered the question seriously, searching for words that would capture the complex mixture of guilt and gratitude and something approaching grace that had been driving his actions since the moment Diego had Dean. recognized his tattoo. Because for 7 years, I've been carrying Roberto's death like it was my fault. Like I should have been faster, smarter, better. Like I could have somehow changed what happened if I had just been more than I was. And last night, listening to you talk about him, watching his children remember him, I realized that I've been carrying the wrong thing. He paused, gathering his thoughts as the sounds of morning chaos continued in the background. I should have been carrying his love for you, his pride in his children, his hope for your future. I should have been carrying the memory of who he was, not just how he died. And maybe, if I help you get where you're going, if I make sure his family is safe and taken care of, maybe I can finally do what he would have wanted me to do. Rodriguez was crying openly now, but she was also smiling, the kind of expression that suggested something broken was finally beginning to heal. He would have liked you, you know. I mean, he already did, obviously, but if he could see this, if he could see what you're doing for us, he would have liked you even more. I already liked him more than I knew how to handle, Marcus admitted. That was part of the problem. The conversation was interrupted by the appearance of 4 children in various stages of wakefulness, their hair sticking up at improbable angles, and their faces bearing the imprints of pillows and couch cushions. Diego immediately gravitated toward Marcus, climbing onto his lap with the same unself-conscious trust he had shown the night before. "Are we going on a trip?" he asked, apparently having overheard enough of the adult conversation to understand the general direction of the discussion. "Maybe," Rodriguez said carefully. "If Marcus really means what he said about driving us to Phoenix." "I mean it," Marcus said firmly. "If you're willing to trust me with your family for a few days, I'd like to help you get where you're going." What followed was a flurry of activity that felt both chaotic and purposeful. The kind of organized confusion that happens when 2 families decide to combine their resources and energy toward a common goal. Phone calls were made to Rodriguez's sister in Phoenix, to Marcus's boss to arrange time off, to Lily's school to explain why she would be missing a few days. Clothes were packed, supplies were gathered, and maps were consulted with the kind of attention to detail that spoke of people who understood the importance of planning for contingencies. Lily threw herself into the preparations with the enthusiasm of someone who had inherited her father's love of spontaneous adventures, chattering excitedly about all the things they might see along the way. The Rodriguez children were more subdued, their responses tempered by years of upheaval and uncertainty. But even they seemed to be catching some of Lily's infectious excitement about the journey ahead. "How long will it take to get there?" Carlos asked, studying the route Marcus had mapped out on his phone. "About 12 hours of driving, but we're not going to do it all at once," Marcus explained. "I thought we'd stop in Colorado Springs first. Maybe see some of the sights there. Then we'll drive through New Mexico and spend the night somewhere. Make it a real road trip, instead of just rushing to get there." "Can we see any dinosaurs?" Miguel wanted to know, his face lighting up with the kind of hope that suggested this was a topic of considerable interest to him. "Absolutely," Marcus said, already mentally revising their route to include some of the fossil sites and museums that dotted the landscape between Denver and Phoenix. "I know just the place." As they prepared to leave, Marcus found himself thinking about the strange chain of events that had brought them all together. 24 hours ago, he had been a single father going through the motions of grocery shopping and dinner preparation, carrying 7 years of guilt and unprocessed grief like stones in his chest. Now he was preparing to embark on a road trip with the family of a man whose death had defined so much of his adult life, and somehow the weight he had been carrying felt lighter than it had in years. Rodriguez seemed to be experiencing something similar, her movements gaining confidence and purpose as the morning progressed. She had been in survival mode for so long that the simple act of planning for something positive, something that looked toward the future instead of just trying to get through the next day, appeared to be reminding her of who she was underneath all the stress and uncertainty. "I keep thinking I'm going to wake up and this will all have been a dream," she confided to Marcus as they loaded the last of their luggage into his truck. "Good things don't usually happen to us like this." "Maybe it's time for that to change," Marcus suggested, securing the last of the bags with bungee cords. "Maybe you've been due for some good things for a while now." The drive south from Denver began with the kind of careful politeness that often marks the beginning of forced proximity between strangers. Everyone conscious of personal space and social boundaries, even as they were literally pressed together in the confines of Marcus's pickup truck. But as the miles passed and the landscape began to change from urban sprawl to rolling hills to the dramatic red rocks of Colorado Springs, the artificial barriers began to dissolve. Diego had claimed his spot next to Marcus again, this time secured by a booster seat that Rodriguez had retrieved from their abandoned car. And he peppered the drive with questions about everything from road signs to cloud formations to the mechanics of internal combustion engines. His curiosity was infectious, drawing the other children into conversations about geography and geology and the physics of flight as they watched planes trace contrails across the vast western sky. "Why is the sky so big here?" Isabella asked, pressing her face against the window as they crested a hill that opened up into a valley that seemed to stretch to the horizon in all directions. "Because there's nothing to make it smaller," Lily said, with the wisdom of someone who had grown up in wide-open spaces. "In the city, there are buildings and trees and stuff that make the sky look like it's in pieces, but out here, you can see the whole thing at once." "It's like God's ceiling," Diego added solemnly, and everyone fell quiet for a moment as they contemplated the immensity of the landscape around them. Their first stop was the Garden of the Gods, where ancient red sandstone formations jutted from the earth like the remnants of some primordial cathedral. The children were out of the truck before Marcus had fully parked, their energy unleashed after hours of confinement, as they ran toward the visitor center with the kind of enthusiasm that made Marcus remember why he had loved being their age. "Careful," Rodriguez called after them, but her voice carried more affection than real concern. For the first time since Marcus had met her, she looked relaxed, the military tension in her shoulders easing as she watched her children explore with genuine joy instead of the careful wariness that had marked their behavior in unfamiliar situations. The afternoon at Garden of the Gods became a revelation for all of them. Marcus found himself seeing the familiar tourist destination through fresh eyes as he watched Diego scramble over rocks with the fearless confidence of childhood. As he listened to the twins debate the geological processes that had created the dramatic formations, as he helped Isabella take pictures with a disposable camera she had found in her backpack. Even Lily seemed energized by having other children to share the experience with, her natural leadership skills emerging as she guided the group along the easier hiking trails. "Look at this one," Carlos called out, pointing to a formation that looked remarkably like a giant's thumb jutting toward the sky. "It looks like it's giving a thumbs up to heaven." "Maybe it's my daddy saying hi," Diego said matter-of-factly, and a simple statement hit Marcus with unexpected force. The idea that Roberto might somehow be present in this moment, approving of the journey they were taking together, felt both impossible and completely logical at the same time. Rodriguez had heard Diego's comment too, and Marcus saw her wipe her eyes quickly before joining her son at the base of the rock formation. "Maybe it is, baby," she said softly, her hand resting on Diego's shoulder. "Maybe Daddy's been watching out for us all along, and he sent Marcus to help us when we needed it most." But thought stayed with Marcus as they continued their exploration, as they ate lunch at a picnic table overlooking Pikes Peak, as they loaded back into the truck for the next leg of their journey. The idea that this entire encounter might be more than coincidence, that Roberto might somehow have orchestrated their meeting from whatever realm the dead inhabited, should have seemed ridiculous to a man who prided himself on rational thinking. But there had been too many small miracles, too many moments of perfect timing, too many instances of exactly the right thing happening at exactly the right moment for Marcus to dismiss the possibility entirely. The drive through New Mexico passed in a comfortable rhythm of conversation and companionable silence, the landscape outside the windows shifting from red rocks to high desert to rolling hills covered in sagebrush and piñones pines. They stopped for dinner at a roadside diner that looked like it hadn't changed since the 1950s, where the waitress called everyone honey, and the green chili cheeseburgers were legendary among locals and travelers alike. "This is the best food I'd had in months," Rodriguez admitted around a bite of enchiladas, her eyes closing in appreciation. "I've forgotten what it felt like to eat something that wasn't from a drive-thru or a gas station," Military food spoils you for the simple pleasures, Marcus agreed, remembering his own adjustment period after returning from deployment. Everything tastes better when you're not eating it out of a bag while wondering if someone's going to start shooting at you. The comment was meant to be light, but it opened a door to deeper conversation about their shared experiences in ways that surprised them both. As the children finished their meals and migrated to an old jukebox in the corner of the diner, Marcus and Rodriguez found themselves talking about things they rarely discussed with civilians. The small details of military life that shaped perspective in ways that were difficult to explain to people who hadn't lived them. Roberto used to say that the hardest part wasn't the danger or the discomfort, Rodriguez said, stirring sugar into her coffee with slow, thoughtful movements. It was coming home and trying to pretend that everything was normal when you knew how quickly normal could disappear. How do you explain to your neighbors that their biggest worry about lawn care seems insignificant when you've seen what happens when people don't have lawns anymore because their houses have been bombed? Marcus nodded, recognizing the struggle she was describing. The adjustment never really ends, does it? You learn to function in the civilian world, but part of you is always scanning for threats, always planning escape routes, always waiting for the other shoe to drop. And then something like yesterday happens, Rodriguez continued, and you remember that sometimes the unexpected thing isn't a disaster. Sometimes it's exactly what you needed, even if you didn't know you needed it. They spent the night at a modest motel outside Albuquerque, 2 adjoining rooms that felt luxurious after months of uncertainty about where Rodriguez and her children would sleep each night. The walls were thin enough that they could hear each other moving around, but there was something comforting about the proximity, the knowledge that they weren't facing whatever came next alone. Marcus lay awake for a long time that night, listening to the sound of traffic on the interstate and thinking about the ways that life could change direction without warning. 24 hours earlier, his biggest concern had been whether Lily was adjusting well to their new living situation after her mother's move. Now, he was lying in a motel room in New Mexico, having committed to driving a family of strangers to Phoenix because one of those strangers happened to be the son of a man who had died in his arms 7 years ago. The logical part of his mind kept insisting that he was making decisions based on emotion rather than reason. That taking responsibility for Rodriguez and her children was a level of involvement that went beyond normal human kindness into something approaching recklessness. But the larger part of him, the part that had been carrying Roberto's memory like a weight for 7 years, felt lighter than it had since the day the convoy had hit the IED outside Kandahar. In the adjoining room, he could hear Rodriguez moving around, probably checking on her children with the kind of hypervigilance that never fully disappeared in parents who had learned that safety was never guaranteed. He wondered if she was having similar thoughts about the strangeness of their situation, the way that chance and choice had combined to bring them together at exactly the moment when they both needed something they hadn't known they were looking for. The next morning brought clear skies and the promise of their final day on the road together. Phoenix was still 6 hours away, but the knowledge that their journey was coming to an end seemed to infuse everyone with a mixture of anticipation and something that might have been regret. They had become a temporary family over the past 2 days, their individual stories weaving together into something larger than the sum of its parts. "I don't want this to be over," Lily confided to Marcus as they loaded their luggage for the last time. "It's been like the best adventure ever, and at home it's just going to be you and me again." The comment hit Marcus harder than he expected, partly because he recognized the truth in it, and partly because he realized that he didn't want it to be over either. The past 2 days had given him a glimpse of what it might feel like to be part of something larger than his small family of 2, to have his life connected to other lives in ways that felt both natural and necessary. "Sometimes adventures end," he told Lily gently, "but that doesn't mean they don't change us. And sometimes, if we're really lucky, ending one adventure just makes room for a new one to begin." The drive through Arizona passed too quickly, the desert landscape outside their windows shifting from scrub brush to saguaro cacti to the urban sprawl that marked the outskirts of Phoenix. With each mile, Marcus could feel the approaching reality of separation. The knowledge that in a few hours he would be dropping Rodriguez and her children off their sister's house and beginning the long drive back to Denver alone. Rodriguez seemed to be feeling something similar, her conversation becoming more stilted as they approached their destination. as if she was already beginning to rebuild the emotional walls that would be necessary for whatever came next. Her children were quieter too, the easy camaraderie of the road trip giving way to the uncertainty that came with another new beginning. Another unfamiliar place where they would have to figure out how to fit in. "There it is," Rodriguez said finally, pointing to a modest ranch house in a neighborhood that looked like it had been built in the 1980s and maintained with care and limited resources ever since. "My sister's place." Marcus pulled into the driveway and turned off the engine, and for a moment they all just sat there. Nobody quite ready to acknowledge that their journey together was over. Through the front window of the house, Marcus could see movement, and then the door opened to reveal a woman who looked enough like Rodriguez to be obviously related. Flanked by two children who appeared to be roughly the same ages as Carlos and Miguel, the reunion that followed was everything Marcus had hoped it would be for Rodriguez and her children. There were tears and laughter, and the kind of fierce hugs that suggested people who had been separated by circumstances beyond their control and were grateful to be together again. Rodriguez's sister, whose name was Carmen, welcomed her family with the kind of open-hearted warmth that made Marcus understand why Rodriguez had been willing to drive halfway across the country to start over. "And you must be Marcus," Carmen said, approaching him with the kind of smile that suggested Rodriguez had called ahead to explain at least some of their story. "I can't thank you enough for what you've done for my sister and her kids. When she called and told me about meeting you, about everything that happened, I could hardly believe it." "It's been my pleasure," Marcus said, and meant it more than he had meant almost anything in recent memory. "Your sister and her children are amazing people. Roberto would be proud of the family he left behind." At the mention of Roberto's name, Carmen's expression shifted to something more complex, a mixture of sadness and understanding that suggested she knew at least something about Marcus's connection to her brother-in-law. "Maria told me that you served with Roberto, that you were there when he died. I want you to know that meant everything to us, knowing that he wasn't alone, that someone who cared about him was with him at the end." The conversation continued as they unloaded luggage and carried bags into the house. But Marcus found himself increasingly aware that his role in this family's story was coming to an end. He was the bridge that had carried them from one chapter of their lives to the next. But now that they had reached their destination, the bridge was no longer necessary. Diego seemed to sense the approaching separation before anyone else, his small hand finding Marcus's and holding on with the kind of desperate grip that suggested he understood exactly what was about to happen. "You're leaving now, aren't you?" he asked quietly, his voice carrying the resignation of a child who had learned that people often left when you most wanted them to stay. "I have to go back to Denver," Marcus said gently, crouching down to Diego's eye level. "Lily has school, and I have work, and you have a new life to start here with your mama and your Aunt Carmen." "But what if I need to talk to you about my daddy?" Diego asked, and the question broke something in Marcus's chest. "What if I have questions and you're not here to answer them?" Marcus reached into his wallet and pulled out a business card, writing his personal phone number on the back in careful block letters. "Then you call me," he said simply. "Anytime you want to talk about your daddy, anytime you have questions, anytime you just want to say hi. I promise I'll answer." Diego took the card with the solemnity of someone receiving a sacred trust, studying the numbers as if he were memorizing them. "Will you call me too? Will you tell me if you remember any more stories about Daddy?" "I will," Marcus promised, and he meant it. "I have lots more stories to tell you. Stories about how brave your daddy was, how much he loved his family, how proud he would be of the young man you're becoming." The goodbye that followed was harder than Marcus had expected, filled with hugs that lasted longer than strictly necessary and promises to stay in touch that felt both important and fragile. Even Lily seemed reluctant to leave. Having bonded with the Rodriguez children in ways that reminded Marcus how much she missed having siblings, how isolated their little family of two could sometimes feel. "Thank you," Rodriguez said finally, standing beside Marcus's truck as he prepared to begin the long drive home. "I know I keep saying that, but I don't think you understand how much this meant to us. Not just the ride, not just the help with practical things, but everything. Meeting you, learning about Roberto from someone who knew him as a soldier, feeling like his death meant something to people besides just us. It did mean something, Marcus said quietly. Roberto's death meant something because his life meant something, because he left behind people who loved him and who carry his memory forward. You and your children are his legacy, the proof that his life mattered in ways that will last long after the rest of us are gone. The drive back to Denver was long and lonely, filled with the kind of silence that comes after intense emotional experiences have ended and ordinary life is waiting to resume. Marcus found himself thinking about the past 3 days. About the strange chain of events that had brought Roberto's family into his life at exactly the moment when he needed them most, about the ways that healing could happen when you least expected it. His phone rang somewhere outside Albuquerque, and he was surprised to see Rodriguez's name on the caller ID. He pulled over at a rest stop to take the call, wondering if there was some problem, some emergency that required his attention. "Is everything okay?" he asked without preamble. "Everything's fine," Rodriguez assured him quickly. "Great, actually. Carmen and I have been talking, and the kids are already settling in like they've lived here their whole lives. But I wanted to call because I realized I never got your address, and Diego wants to send you a thank you card." Marcus smiled, picturing Diego carefully composing a letter with the same serious attention he brought to everything else. "I'd love that," he said, and gave her his address. "There's something else," Rodriguez continued, her voice taking on a different quality. "I've been thinking about what you said, about carrying Roberto's love instead of just his own death. And I realized that maybe that works both ways. Maybe instead of carrying guilt about not being able to save him, you could carry pride in the fact that you tried. Gratitude for the time you had with him. Love for the person he was and the family he left behind." The words hit Marcus with the force of revelation, reframing 7 years of grief and self-recrimination in a way that felt both simple and profound. "I never thought about it like that," he admitted. "Roberto always said that the best way to honor the dead was to take care of the living," Rodriguez said softly. "I think maybe that's what you've been doing, even if you didn't realize it. Taking care of his family, making sure his children know their father was loved and remembered, helping us get to a place where we can build a future he would be proud of." After the call ended, Marcus sat in his truck for a long time, watching the sun set over the New Mexico desert and thinking about the difference between carrying guilt and carrying love. The weight was the same, but the burden felt entirely different, transformed from something that pulled him down into something that lifted him up. The weeks that followed his return to Denver settled into a new rhythm that felt both familiar and changed. He went back to work, Lily went back to school, and their life resumed the comfortable patterns they had established over the months since her mother's departure. But now, there were regular phone calls from Phoenix, pictures sent via text message of Diego's latest art projects, and the twins' soccer games, updates on Isabella's progress in her new school and Rodriguez's job search. Marcus found himself looking forward to these glimpses into their lives with an anticipation that surprised him. He had expected the connection forged during their road trip to fade with time and distance, but instead, it seemed to be growing stronger, evolving from crisis-born necessity into something that felt more like genuine friendship, like chosen family. "Diego wants to know if you can come visit for Christmas," Rodriguez told him during one of their weekly calls, about 6 weeks after he had dropped them off in Phoenix. "Carmen says you're welcome to stay here, and the kids have been planning all the things they want to show you around the city." The invitation caught Marcus off guard, both because of how much he wanted to accept it and because of how natural the idea of spending holidays with Roberto's family seemed. "Are you sure that wouldn't be too much trouble? Are you kidding?" Rodriguez laughed, and Marcus realized it was the first time he had heard her laugh with genuine joy rather than politeness or obligation. "These kids talk about you constantly. Lily this and Marcus that, stories about your road trip adventures, questions about when they're going to see you again. You're part of the family now, whether you like it or not." Part of the family. The phrase stuck with Marcus long after the call ended, warming something in his chest that had been cold for longer than he cared to admit. He had been focused for so long on the family he had lost through divorce, on trying to rebuild something stable for himself and Lily after their world had shifted beneath their feet, that he hadn't considered the possibility of family being something that could be chosen and created rather than just inherited or married into. Christmas in Phoenix turned out to be everything the children had promised and more. Carmen's modest house was transformed into a celebration of warmth and abundance, filled with the kind of controlled chaos that comes with multiple children and adults all trying to create perfect memories at the same time. Marcus and Lily fit into the festivities as if they had always been part of them, drawn into traditions both familiar and new. Diego had indeed made him a thank you card, but it had evolved over the weeks into something much more elaborate. A hand-bound book filled with drawings and stories about his father, about their road trip, about the new life his family was building in Phoenix. Each page was a work of art in the way that only children's creations could be, combining realistic details with fantastical elements in ways that captured emotional truth more effectively than any photograph. "This is the day you helped us in the rain," Diego explained, pointing to a drawing that showed a man and a woman with 4 children standing beside a broken car while rain fell in careful blue lines from a gray sky. "And this is Daddy watching from heaven, making sure you found us when we needed help." In the drawing, Roberto was depicted as an angel with wings, hovering above the scene with a smile that managed to be both sad and happy at the same time. It was the kind of theological complexity that adults spent years trying to understand. Distilled into a child's simple acceptance that love transcended death, and that sometimes the people who were gone found ways to take care of the people who were left behind. "Do you really think that's what happened?" Marcus asked, studying the drawing with the serious attention it deserved. Diego nodded with absolute certainty. "Mama says Daddy sends us angels when we need them most, and you were our angel that day, even if you don't have wings." The conversation was interrupted by Isabella calling everyone to dinner. But Diego's words stayed with Marcus throughout the evening, through the meal filled with laughter and storytelling, through the present opening ceremony that seemed to go on for hours, through the quiet moments when the adults sat around the table with coffee and pie, while the children played with their new toys in the living room. Later that night, after the children had finally been convinced to go to bed and Carmen had retired to her room with a book, Marcus and Rodriguez found themselves alone on the back patio, looking up at a sky so clear that the stars seemed close enough to touch. "This has been perfect," Marcus said quietly, meaning it in ways that went beyond the simple success of a holiday celebration. "Thank you for including us, for making us part of all this." "Thank you for wanting to be part of it," Rodriguez replied. "For the past year, holidays have been something to get through rather than something to enjoy. But having you and Lily here, seeing the kids so happy, it feels like we're finally building something new instead of just surviving what we lost." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts about the strange journey that had brought them to this moment. Marcus found himself thinking about Roberto, wondering what his friend would think of the life his family was building, of the way his children were growing up strong and kind despite the challenges they had faced. "I have something for you," Rodriguez said suddenly, reaching into her jacket pocket and pulling out a small wrapped package. "It's not much, but I wanted you to have it." Marcus unwrapped the gift carefully, revealing a silver dog tag on a simple chain. But this wasn't a standard military identification tag, he realized as he examined it more closely. It was a memorial piece, engraved with Roberto's name, rank, and dates of service, along with a simple inscription that read, "Until we meet again." "I had it made for you," Rodriguez explained, her voice soft in the darkness. "Because you carried him home in your heart when his body couldn't make the journey, and I wanted you to have something to remind you that he's still with you, still grateful for everything you did." Marcus held the dog tag in his palm, feeling the weight of the metal and the greater weight of the gesture behind it. "I don't know what to say." "Don't say anything," Rodriguez said gently. "Just wear it. And remember that you're not carrying guilt anymore. You're carrying love and memory and the knowledge that good people sometimes find each other when they need it most." The flight back to Denver the day after Christmas was bittersweet, filled with promises to visit again soon and plans for future adventures together. But Marcus no longer felt like he was leaving family behind. He felt like he was carrying family with him, woven into his life in ways that distance couldn't diminish. The months that followed brought new developments and deepening connections. Rodriguez found a job with a security company that valued her military experience. Isabella thrived in her new school, and the twins joined a youth soccer league where their natural athleticism quickly made them Badares. Local favorites. Diego continued to send Marcus pictures and stories, their phone conversations becoming a highlight of both their weeks. But perhaps the most significant change was in Marcus himself. The guilt that had defined so much of his adult life had been replaced by something more complex, and ultimately, more healing. A sense of purpose that went beyond just getting through each day. He found himself volunteering with veteran support organizations, using his experience to help other soldiers navigate the transition from military to civilian life. He started a support group for families of fallen service members, creating a space where people could share stories and memories without having to explain the depth of their loss to those who hadn't experienced it themselves. Roberto would be proud, Rodriguez told him during one of their calls after Marcus had described his latest volunteer work. He always said that the best way to honor the people we've lost is to make sure their sacrifice means something, that it makes the world a little bit better for the people who are still here. 1 year after their first meeting in the grocery store parking lot, Marcus and Lily made another trip to Phoenix, this time for Diego's 7th birthday party. The boy had grown taller and more confident over the months, but he still possessed the same intuitive understanding of emotional currents that had allowed him to recognize Marcus's connection to his father from the very beginning. "I'm glad you're my dad's friend," Diego told Marcus as they sat together on Carmen's back patio, watching the other children play in the yard. "I'm glad he had people who cared about him when he was being a soldier, and I'm glad those people care about us too." "I'm glad too," Marcus said, meaning it more than he had ever meant anything in his life. "Your dad was lucky to have a family like you, and I'm lucky that his family became part of mine." As the afternoon wore on and the celebration continued around them, Marcus found himself thinking about the mysterious ways that lives intersect and influence each other. How a chance encounter in a storm could lead to healing that no one could have predicted or planned. He thought about Roberto, about the man who had died too young but whose love continued to shape the world through the family he had left behind and the friends who carried his memory forward. The dog tag that Rodriguez had given him rested against his chest, a tangible reminder that some bonds transcend death, that love is stronger than loss, and that sometimes the most important journeys begin with a single decision to help a stranger in the rain. He had set out to repay a debt he thought he owed to a fallen comrade, but he had discovered instead that the greatest gift he could give Roberto's memory was to love and protect the family his friend had left behind. As the sun set over Phoenix and the birthday party wound down to its natural conclusion, Marcus looked around at the faces of people who had become central to his life in ways he never could have anticipated. Rodriguez was laughing at something Carmen had said, her face relaxed and happy in a way that would have been impossible to imagine a year ago. Isabella and Lily were deep in conversation about books and music and all the things that teenage girls found endlessly fascinating. The twins were engaged in some elaborate game with their cousins, their voices rising and falling in the kind of competitive banter that marked happy childhood. And Diego sat beside him, still small for his age, but carrying himself with the quiet confidence of a child who knew he was loved and valued and remembered by people who mattered. In his lap, he held the book he had made for Marcus, adding new pages and stories as his understanding of his father's life and death continued to evolve and deepen. "Next year, can we all go camping together?" Diego asked suddenly, looking up at Marcus with eyes that still held traces of the sadness that would probably always be part of him, but that also sparkled with excitement about future possibilities. "I want to see the mountains where Daddy used to train, and I want to tell him about all the good things that happened because you helped us." "I think that sounds like a perfect plan," Marcus said, and he meant it. Because somewhere in the past year, while he had been focused on helping Roberto's family heal from their loss, he had discovered that his own healing had been happening too, quietly and steadily, like a wound that closes so gradually you don't notice it until one day you realize the pain is gone. The drive back to the airport that evening was quiet, filled with the comfortable silence of people who had shared something meaningful and were content to let it settle into memory without needing to analyze or explain it. As Phoenix disappeared behind them, and the desert landscape gave way to the lights of the city. Marcus reflected on how much had changed since that rainy night, when he had first encountered Rodriguez and her children in the Burr grocery store parking lot. He had thought he was just offering a ride to strangers, a simple act of kindness that would be forgotten as soon as it was completed. Instead, he had found a new family, a new purpose, and a new understanding of what it meant to carry the memory of those who had died in service to their country. Roberto Rodriguez was gone, had been gone for 7 years, but his influence continued to ripple outward through the lives of everyone who had known and loved him. As the plane lifted off from Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport, carrying Marcus and Lily back to their life in Denver, Marcus touched the dog tag beneath his shirt and silently promised Roberto that he would continue to watch over the family his friend had left behind. Continue to be the kind of man Roberto would have been proud to call brother. Continue to transform grief into love and loss into lasting connection. The story had begun with rain and a broken-down car and a child's intuitive recognition of shared sorrow. It would continue with birthday parties and phone calls and camping trips and all the small, everyday moments that bind families together across distance and time. And at the center of it all would be the memory of a soldier who had died too young, but whose love had created a legacy that would outlast them all. Carried forward by the people who had been touched by his life and transformed by his death into something better than they had been before. Some stories end with dramatic revelations or spectacular transformations. This one ended with the quiet recognition that healing happens gradually, that families can be chosen as well as inherited, and that sometimes the greatest gift we can offer someone is simply to remember them not for how they died, but for how they lived and who they loved and what they left behind. In remembering Roberto Rodriguez as a father and husband and friend rather than just as a casualty of war, Marcus had found a way to honor both the man his friend had been and the family he had cherished above all else. The rain that had brought them together on that first night had long since stopped, but the connections it had made possible would last for the rest of their lives, growing stronger with each passing season, each shared holiday. Each moment when Diego looked up at the sky and pointed out clouds that looked like his father waving hello from whatever realm the beloved dead inhabit. And in those moments, Marcus would remember that love really is stronger than death, that some bonds transcend the physical world, and that angels don't always have wings. Sometimes they just have the courage to stop and help. Strangers in the Rain.